Imagine a school you would be happy going to every day. When I present this idea to people, there are a few people who actually give me a picture of this school, usually younger people. They can tell you what it would look like, what it would feel like, what would be going on in there. But usually the answers I get from people are, that's crazy. Happy going to school every day? As if this is an absolutely absurd idea. So I change the idea and I present it to people this way. Imagine a school your children would be happy going to every day. And then the reaction is, oh yeah, that's a great idea. I'd love that for my children. I want a school that my children would be happy going to every day. People tell me this, and I want a school for my children that they would be happy going to every day too. These are my 3 children. My son is 14. He's actually 14 today. Everyone say happy birthday. He's in the 8th grade. My older daughter is 11. She's in the 6th grade. And my younger daughter is 9. She's in the 4th grade. There's lots of wonderful things about these 3 people that made my life much, much better. But as a teacher, as an educator of over 20 years, one thing that's extremely wonderful about them for me is they've provided me with my own private informal study. I've been able to watch their attitudes about school change as they've gone through elementary and middle school, and I've noticed it change. I particularly noticed it when my 11-year-old was in the 2nd grade. There were mornings where she was very unhappy about going to school, and they stood out in stark contrast to the other days. And I remembered that my son had started to do this during 2nd grade as well. So I keep a journal, and I just started to keep track of how many days they demonstrated a positive attitude about going to school versus a negative or ambivalent attitude about going to school. And the criteria was very simple to identify. Kids jumped up out of bed, were happy about having breakfast, throw their clothes on and run out to school, or say things like, I can't wait for school today. Those were days they were happy about going to school. Days where they were very reluctant to get out of bed, didn't want to get up downstairs to have breakfast, and said things like, I don't want to go to school today. Do I have to go to school today? Those were days I tracked as negative or ambivalent. When I started to put my ideas together for this talk, I looked back through my journals, and I thought, oh, this would be great. I started to track and collect the data on these days, and I put together a chart. I call it SMILE data. These are the percentage of days my children demonstrated happiness about going to school. And as you can see, there is a general downward decline. The good news is there's some upticks in years from one year to the next, but the downward decline is rather disturbing. Now the problem with this data is it's not very scientific. I can't draw any valid conclusions from this data. The experimental group is very small. There's no control group, and I have a deep bias toward all 3 of the subjects. So I want to ask the audience today to help me validate this data, or maybe show me I'm off track. Okay? And I'm going to ask you one question. Was there a year in school where you stopped liking going to school? Think about it. From kindergarten to whatever highest grade you got up to in school, was there a year where you just stopped liking going to school? What was that year? I want you to put that year in your head. If you're lucky enough to say, there was never a year, I like going to school from kindergarten to whatever grade you got up to, that's great too. Okay? Does everyone have an answer to that question in their head? I'm going to ask everyone to stand up. If you're watching live, stand up too. I'm going to go through the school years, and when I get to the year that you stopped liking going to school, I'd like you to sit down. Again, if your answer was never, you'll remain standing. We'll put you on the spot. Today will be the first day you don't like going to school. Okay, so if you stopped liking going to school from grades kindergarten to 2, please sit down. 3 to 5, please sit down. 6th or 7th, 8th or 9th grade, 10th to 12th, maybe in college. Okay, so if you look around the room, it looks like you guys helped validate some of my data. The vast majority of people in the room are sitting down. I started to wonder about why does this happen, but I decided to skip that question because the reactions I got to that question were, oh, that's just the way school is. Kids just have to get used to it. And, oh, they have to learn to play the game and give teachers what they want. So that was very disturbing to me. So I changed the question again. I said, does it have to be this way? Do schools have to be places where kids stop liking going to them. And I looked into a lot. I researched it. I talked to colleagues. I read a lot. And I found out that a whole bunch of people think no. This gentleman in particular feels very strongly that it does not have to be this way. His name is Daniel Pink. He's the author of Drive, The Surprising Truth of What Motivates Us, as well as 6, 7, 8 other books. He also worked for Robert Reich when Robert Reich was Secretary of Labor under President Clinton. And he has one of the most popular TED Talks on TED, over 10 million views on his TED Talk about that book. He says no. In his book, he cites dozens and dozens and dozens of studies that show over and over again that schools, even other organizations in our culture, but schools in particular sometimes are created in a way that makes them stop liking going to school. And it doesn't have to be this way. The last person on the list, who no one knows how to pronounce his name, it's actually Csikszentmihalyi. In particular, he showed very clearly that the systems we have of reward and punishment, grades, discipline issues that we have in school actually create a situation where students stop liking to learn. So this led me to, if all of these people feel like it doesn't have to be that way, are there already schools in existence that people like going to? Or children like going to every day? Do these schools exist? I found out they do. There are many of them all over the world. Many of them are right here in New England. For example, the Sudbury Valley School in Framingham, Massachusetts, is a very famous school with a deep dedication to democratic education. Another example is the Met High School in Providence, Rhode Island, and a sister campus, Depot Campus School, in Mansfield, Connecticut. Both of these schools are part of an organization called Big Picture Learning that helps manage schools, 60 schools around the world. Another example, it's not a school, it's a nonprofit organization called Green Schools that works with individual students, individual schools, clubs in a school, and they'll work with whole school districts, and they help connect students to the very important issues related to the environment, helping kids take control about improving the environment of their own schools and their communities. And finally, an incredible school within a school called the Independent Project. It was devised by, started by, and implemented by high school students in Monument Mountain High School in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, all the way out in western Massachusetts. Now, I visited some of these schools, I investigated these schools, I talked to people in these schools, and I found people smiling. Staff, students, administrators, custodians. So I started to call them, in my own mind, I started to call them smiling schools, because that's what I saw there. I heard people say, I can't wait to come back tomorrow and keep working on what I'm working on. So when I saw that these schools already exist, I said, we want one in our community for our children. So I investigated them. I wanted to find out what do they have in common, so I could take all of the pieces that they had in common and put them together into a new learning environment for our children here in central Massachusetts. I looked at all of the things that people traditionally look at when they investigate a school. I looked at curriculum, I looked at textbooks, I looked at parent involvement, I looked at teacher training, all of the things that people normally look at. And I was dismayed because I found out that all of these programs were very different. These things they weren't exactly the same from school to school, except for one thing. There was one thing that they all had in common. It all boiled down to one thing: trust. All of the programs, everything they did in these schools was based on a trust in young people. The belief that young people are human beings, and human beings have a natural desire to learn. And if all we need to do is feed this natural desire to learn, and they will learn at rigorous levels. So again, I continued to look at this, and I started to compare smiling schools to what I call unsmiling schools, which some people might call traditional, conventional education. And I found out that smiling schools, built on a sense of trust in students, was really in contrast to unsmiling schools. There is an underlying distrust of students in lots of traditional education. The idea that if we don't force them to learn, they won't learn. If we don't tell them what classes they must take, they won't learn this important material. They won't set out to learn the material. We tell them where to sit in rooms. We tell them that they may or may not speak during lunch in some schools. Students report to me that teachers don't give them permission to go to the bathroom. So the building a school on trust had a lot of benefits, and it was the benefits that was putting smiles on people's faces. For example, students in smiling schools have a deep sense of ownership of their own school. I met students at the Depot Campus School in Connecticut, and they talked to me about their school, their quizzes, their tests, their ways of assessment, as if they owned them. It wasn't somebody else imposing them on them. Whereas in unsmiling schools, there's a sense of occupancy, a tendency. I'm only here because I'm forced to be here. I'm going to get out as fast as I can. That does not put smiles on people's faces when they feel that way. Another huge benefit to building schools on trust is there was a freedom to fail in these organizations. There was almost a celebration of failure, which sounds very strange to people, but when people messed up, when things didn't work out the way they anticipated, when mistakes were made, people got together in teams and they said, okay, what happened here? Let's figure out what's going on. How can we make it better? Let's try again. That whole idea of, these students were persevering on their own without someone forcing them to do it. Whereas in unsmiling schools, there is a deep fear of failure. We try very hard to prevent people from failing in school. But they do, because that's what happens. Everybody recognizes that students are going to fail from time to time. But what do we do when they fail? We punish them. You're a failure. You failed. There's something wrong with you. You're a bad student. And then we ignore it. We just say, oh, too bad for you. We're moving on to the next unit. You're going to have to figure out some way or other to catch up. Again, in smiling schools, a thing people just don't believe me about. Cheating becomes obsolete. When you trust students to make choices about what they want to learn, they know without even being told that they don't have to cheat because it's not going to get them to where they want to be that they already chose. They chose their goal. A simple example is learn to play the guitar. If you choose to learn to play the guitar, you automatically don't even think about cheating because you know it's not going to get you to where you want to be. Whereas in unsmiling schools, cheating has become ubiquitous. It's a huge problem. And as an example of this, I did a very informal survey. I asked an anonymous question, 300 students. Do you at least sometimes take other people's homework, put your name on it, and turn it in as your own to get the work done? Of 300 students, how many do you believe? How many would you think said yes? 297. And these are students we're preparing for college, we're preparing for the workplace. And we wonder about why all the cheating and corruption is going on in the institutions and our culture. The final benefit I saw that put smiles on people's faces were smiling schools were able to establish long-term lofty goals. They use the term lofty goals. I heard someone at the Met say, we're helping people become better people. Whereas in unsmiling schools, we talk about helping people become lifelong learners. But really what we're doing is we have very short-term immediate goals. How do you pass the quiz? How do you pass the test? How do you pass the class? How do you get your diploma so you can get out and move on? Another example of these lofty goals, to bring your attention back to the Sudbury Valley School in Framingham, Massachusetts. The students in this school, they work with students aged 4 to 19. The students have a say in every aspect of the day-to-day operations of their school. They choose what they want to learn. They choose how they want to learn about how to go about learning it. They choose how they want to spend their days. They have a vote on things like budget, discipline policies, even who gets hired and who does not get rehired at the end of the year. You talk about this in unsmiling schools, people say that is absolutely crazy. How could you do that? Well, Daniel Greenberg, one of the leaders of the Sudbury Valley School, talks about how can we expect people to be active members of their democracy at 19 years old when they've spent 18 years of their lives in authoritarian systems that give them no voice, no ability to vote, no ability to act democratically in their schools. This makes perfect sense to me. The next question I get asked all the time is, okay, great. You got these schools, you let people choose what they want to learn, you let them choose how they want to spend their days. Well, what about learning? Does any academic learning happen in these schools? Some of these schools are the only organizations that have long-term longitudinal studies of their students long into their lives after they graduate from school. Big Picture Learning has one of the best longitudinal studies of their students after graduation. The Sudbury Valley follows their students for life. These students are working in fields of their own choosing. They're reporting that they're happy at their work. They're reporting that they're happy with their families, and they feel like they're good providers for their children. I don't know what else we want from our schools but that. So this is what I want. This is my daughter as she goes to school almost every morning. This is what she looks like as she walks into the school building most mornings. She does not look happy. She says it's because her backpack is too heavy sometimes. I don't want her looking like this as she's walking into her school building, getting ready to learn for the day. I want her to look like this. This is how she should look at school. This is how she has looked at school some days. So we have to talk about this. We're building a smiling school in our community for my daughter, for my son. And I know that there are people in our community that want it for their children too. The way I figure it is, if you're someone who believes that school isn't supposed to be fun, you don't want your children to be smiling at school. Well, there's plenty of options for those schools. You have a ton of options to send your children to those schools. I want a smiling school here. We need one. We're going to build one. We need to talk about this. I can't wait to hear your ideas for how we can go about building a smiling school right here in our community. Thank you very much.